Okay, welcome to the deep dive. You've shared some really fascinating source material with us today. It's all centered around, well, these potential links between a ketogenic diet, our gut microbes, and something really important like colon cancer risk.
That's right. Yeah, we're primarily digging into a transcript from a YouTube discussion. It breaks down some new research data
Hmm,
it's pretty intriguing stuff.
definitely makes you think.
It really does. It's the kind of study that highlights just how complex diet and health interactions actually are.
Absolutely. So our mission here for this deep dive is to really unpack all of this. We want to understand what the data is actually telling us, pull out the key takeaways, and maybe highlight some things that might genuinely surprise you.
And it's important context why we're even looking at this. I mean, colorectal cancer,
Yeah.
it's not rare. It's the third most common cancer worldwide, affects millions.
Yeah. And disturbingly, the rates seem to be going up, especially in younger folks.
Exactly, which just makes exploring these potential links to lifestyle factors like diet, along with things we already know about like obesity and smoking, well, it makes it feel pretty urgent.
So understanding how what we eat, or even how our food interacts with our gut bacteria, could play a role,
Mm-hmm.
that seems vital.
Mm-mm. And this particular research, it took a really specific approach to try and make the findings more relevant to humans. They used what they call microbiome humanized mice.
Microbiome humanized mice. Okay, let's break that down a little. What exactly does that mean they did?
So instead of using just standard lab mice with their, typical mouse gut bacteria, they started with mice that were basically germ-free, no microbes.
Okay.
Then they gave them a cocktail, essentially, of human gut microbes. They pulled stool samples from 5 healthy human volunteers
Right.
and transplanted that diverse human microbiome into these germ-free mice.
Oh, okay. So the idea was to give the mice a gut environment that's like closer to a human's gut
Mhm.
to make the results maybe more applicable to us.
Precisely. Yeah, it's a way to try and bridge that gap, between a standard animal model and something that behaves a bit more like a human system, at least when it comes to the microbiome.
Smart. Makes sense. So, okay, they have these humanized mice. How did they then set up the experiment to look at colon cancer specifically?
Right. So, first, they treated the mice in a way that induces intestinal inflammation. It makes them more susceptible to developing colon tumors, kind of gives them a predisposition.
Okay, setting the stage for potential cancer.
Exactly. Then they split these mice into 2 main groups. One group got a pretty standard high-carb chow diet, the kind of stuff lab mice often eat.
And the other group?
The other group was fed a low-carb, high-fat ketogenic diet, and they did check to make sure this group actually had elevated ketone levels, so the diet was working as intended.
Got it. And this is where it gets really interesting. What actually happened? What did they find when they compared those two groups?
The results were, well, they're pretty remarkable, actually. The mice on the ketogenic diet, they developed dramatically fewer tumors.
Fewer tumors. Okay.
Yeah, and the tumors they did get were smaller. The overall, tumor burden in their intestines was significantly lower compared to the mice on the standard chow. It wasn't just a small difference.
Wow. Okay. So a really striking protective effect from the keto diet in this specific model.
Mm-hmm.
But, when you see something like that, the big question is why, right?
Exactly.
Was it the diet itself acting directly? Or maybe something the diet changed? And crucially, were the gut microbes involved?
Precisely. That's the key question. To figure out that causal link, especially the role of the microbiome, they did another experiment, a fecal microbiome transplant, or FMT.
Okay, an FMT. So what did they transplant and who got it?
Right. So they took gut microbes collected from the mice that had been eating the ketogenic diet, the protected mice,
Uh-huh.
and they transferred those specific microbes into a new group of mice.
Yeah.
And this new group, they had not been eating the keto diet themselves. They were on the standard chow.
Okay. Interesting. So did the protection travel with the microbes?
Astonishingly, yes, it did. Transplanting the microbiome from those keto-fed mice actually gave anti-cancer protection to the recipient mice, even though the recipients weren't eating keto.
Wow. That's pretty powerful evidence, isn't it? It really suggests the keto diet wasn't just working on its own, but that it changed the mice's gut bugs in a way that was directly protective.
Absolutely. It strongly points to the microbiome mediating the effect. The diet changed the microbial community, and that altered community provided the protection against tumor growth.
Which naturally leads to the next question. What was it about this changed microbiome? What were these beneficial microbes doing or maybe producing?
Right. And the research managed to pinpoint a potential key player. A specific molecule seemed to be involved.
Okay, what was it?
It was a particular fatty acid called stearic acid. It's an 18-carbon saturated fat.
Stearic acid, okay. And how does that fit in with the keto diet and the microbiome connection?
Well, what the researchers found was that the ketogenic diet in these humanized mice seemed to select for or encourage the growth of certain bacterial communities in the gut. And these communities were particularly good at producing more of this stearic acid.
Ah, so the diet kind of shifted the gut ecosystem towards microbes that churn out more stearic acid.
That's the idea. Yeah.
Okay, so the keto diet boosts microbes that make stearic acid. Then how does the stearic acid itself fight the cancer, according to this study? What's the mechanism?
It looked like stearic acid was working through a couple of main pathways, kind of a two-pronged attack.
Okay, what's prong number one?
First, it seemed to directly cause tumor cells to die. It triggered something called apoptosis.
Programmed cell death.
Exactly. Programmed cell suicide, basically telling the cancer cells to self-destruct.
Okay, so it hits the cancer cells directly. What was the second part of the attack?
The second mechanism was more about the environment around the tumor. Stearic acid helped to suppress inflammation in the intestines. Specifically, it decreased the levels and the activity of a type of inflammatory immune cell called a Th17 cell.
Th17 cells.
Yeah.
Right, those are often linked to promoting tumor growth in inflammatory settings.
They often are, yeah. So by reducing those, stearic acid was helping to calm down that pro-tumor inflammatory environment.
So like you said, a 1-2 punch,
Mm.
killing cancer cells and making the neighborhood less friendly for cancer growth. That's pretty neat.
It is, yeah, a nice dual mechanism. And just as a quick aside, the source mentioned, it's probably worth noting that the ketone bodies themselves, the things produced when you're on a keto diet, might also have some direct protective effects.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, the mechanisms there are thought to be complex, maybe involving reducing inflammation directly or helping with intestinal stem cell renewal. They're signaling through receptors like HAR2. It's a whole field, actually. The source mentioned a review by Dr. Joseph Sedlak that gets into colon cancer metabolism if people want more detail.
Right, so it's likely not just the stearic acid. Multiple things potentially contributing from the keto diet.
Probably, yeah.
But focusing back on stearic acid for a moment,
Mm-hmm.
this raises a really practical question. If the protection comes from stearic acid made by the gut bugs, what happens if you just, eat more stearic acid? Does getting it directly in your diet do the same thing?
That's a great question. And the researchers tested exactly that. They did another experiment. This time, they took mice that were not on a ketogenic diet, just the standard chow again, but they gave them supplemental stearic acid directly in their food.
And what did they see?
They saw a similar anti-cancer effect from that direct dietary supplementation.
Huh. Okay, so the takeaway there seems to be whether your gut microbes make it because you're eating keto or whether you eat it directly, the stearic acid itself seems to offer these protective benefits against colon tumor growth, at least in this mouse model.
That appears to be the conclusion from this particular set of experiments, yes. And, practically speaking, while you could supplement, getting stearic acid from food sources is often pretty achievable, especially on diets that naturally include more fat.
Right, which leads to the obvious next question. Where do we find stearic acid in foods? The source mentioned a few key ones.
Yes, it did. Tallow that's rendered beef fat is noted as being quite high, typically around 15 to 20% stearic acid by weight.
Tallow. Okay.
Apparently, the word stearate actually comes from the Greek word for tallow, so there's a little connection there.
Huh. Interesting bit of trivia. Okay, so tallow is one source. What else?
Cocoa butter is another really rich source. Contains about 34% stearic acid, roughly.
Cocoa butter.
And in chocolate.
Exactly. And also shea butter, which comes from the nut of the African shea tree. That's also very high, often over 30%, sometimes even up to 50% stearic acid. Okay, so tallow, cocoa butter, shea butter. Good examples. Now, this finding about stearic acid, especially the link to tallow or beef fat, this brings us to what the source called a provocative possibility, right?
Yes, exactly. Because think about it. This mouse study suggests a component of beef fat, stearic acid, might actually suppress cancer development in this context.
Which seems to fly in the face of a lot of the public health messaging we hear, doesn't it? The kind, linking red meat intake to an increased risk of colon cancer, often based on observational studies.
It does seem contradictory on the surface, and the source really tries to provide some important context here to help reconcile this apparent conflict.
Okay, how do they approach that?
Well, first, they really emphasize that stearic acid is just one compound in a very complex food like red meat. Meat contains lots of other things, different fats, proteins, vitamins, minerals like iron, which can have its own effects, especially in certain contexts like iron overload.
Right, so you can't just isolate one molecule and say that defines the effect of the whole food.
Exactly. And one study looking at one mechanism doesn't automatically cancel out decades of population research, even acknowledging the flaws in that research. It's just one piece of a much larger puzzle.
Okay, so complexity of food is point one. What else?
Second, they do point out the known limitations of those big epidemiological studies that often link red meat to cancer risk.
Like the food questionnaires?
Yeah, reliance on things like food frequency questionnaires, which can be notoriously inaccurate. People are bad at remembering or reporting what they eat accurately. And then there's the huge issue of confounding factors.
Stuff that goes along with eating red meat but isn't the meat itself.
Right, or stuff that goes along with not eating red meat. Things like healthy user bias, for example. People who report eating less red meat might also be more likely to exercise, not smoke, eat more vegetables.
Gotcha. So it's really hard to pin the blame solely on the red meat itself in those studies.
It's very difficult to establish clear cause and effect from that type of data alone. There are just too many variables that are hard to control for or even measure accurately.
Okay, so limitations of epi studies. What was the third point?
The third point, and this is maybe the most crucial one highlighted by this specific mouse study, is that the overall dietary and metabolic context seems to matter immensely.
Context, meaning?
Meaning how a food is consumed, what else it's consumed with, and the metabolic state of the individual eating it. This mouse study is presented as a kind of proof of principle, showing how a specific dietary pattern, in this case keto, can dramatically change the gut environment, and through that change, potentially alter the biological effects of certain food components, like the stearic acid.
So the effect of something like beef fat might not be fixed. It could depend entirely on the rest of the diet and how healthy the person is metabolically.
That's the provocative possibility they raise. The source uses a specific example. They say it's plausible, based on this mechanism, that maybe a fatty ribeye steak could contribute to cancer promotion if you eat it with a huge pile of French fries and you're obese or metabolically unhealthy. But potentially, that same ribeye, eaten by someone metabolically healthy, maybe as part of a clean, low-carb, high-fat diet, could actually be providing beneficial stearic acid, maybe even suppressing cancer via the microbiome changes.
Wow.
And they stress, this isn't a definitive claim about ribeyes specifically. It's more an illustration of how context could fundamentally shift the health impact of a food.
That really does underscore the complexity, doesn't it? It challenges that simple idea that any single food is just universally good or bad for everyone all the time.
It certainly pushes back against oversimplification. This study adds a really fascinating layer, emphasizing the dynamic role of the microbiome and suggesting that our metabolic health might be a key determinant in how our bodies respond to specific dietary fats like stearic acid, particularly concerning cancer risk.
Okay, let's try and synthesize all this then. If someone's listening, what are the main things you'd want them to take away from this deep dive into the source?
Well, I think the core finding from this specific research in this model is this plausible mechanism. A ketogenic diet can change the gut microbiome, leading to increased production of stearic acid. And that stearic acid seems to fight colon tumor growth by killing cancer cells and reducing inflammation.
Okay, mechanism identified.
Yeah, and the study also suggests that getting stearic acid directly from the diet might have similar protective effects. However, and this is a big however, the relationship between complex whole foods, like red meat, and cancer risk is way more complicated. It's influenced by the entire dietary pattern, all the other components in the food, and, very importantly, the individual's metabolic state or context.
Right, so the diet matters, the gut bugs matter,
Right.
specific fats like stearic acid might matter, but maybe how your body is functioning overall and everything else you're eating could be even more critical in the big picture.
That really seems to be the overarching message that the source reinforces. They actually wrap up with a thought that kind of ties it all together nicely.
Yeah. What's that?
They basically conclude that ultimately, focusing on an overall anti-inflammatory, unprocessed dietary pattern is probably going to be much more impactful for reducing your colon cancer risk than getting hyper-focused on the effect of any single food item in isolation, whether that's a ribeye steak or lamb chops or even, a piece of dark chocolate because of the cocoa butter.
That feels like a really balanced and grounded perspective. It takes the specific science, but puts it back into that broader, more practical dietary context. This has definitely given us a lot to chew on.
It really has. It's a great example of how science progresses, adding nuance, sometimes challenging older ideas, and showing us just how much more there is to learn.
Absolutely. And building right on that, here's maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to consider. If our individual metabolic health and the incredibly complex dance between our diet and our gut microbes can so profoundly shape how the foods we eat affect us, what does that really mean for generalized, one-size-fits-all dietary advice?
Yeah.
And just how much more is there still to uncover about these intricate connections between what we eat, our inner ecosystem, and our long-term health risks?
A question that definitely opens the door for many more deep dives in the future.